ask a question or give a comment? Okay. Doesn't seem too bad. Might be able to get to that third inning anyway. All right, so we're going to start right here. I'm going to ask that you keep your questions and comments to about a minute so we can cover everybody.
Thank you. My name is Maura Harrington, and I'm the president of the Newtonville Area Council. And I just wanted to take a moment to make a short announcement. So thank you for your attention. The Newtonville Area Council is pleased to announce that we've published an analysis of our Envisioning Washington Street survey that we conducted last June. We received more than 2,500 survey responses from residents all over Newton, with most responses from residents from wards 1, 2, and 3, which abuts Washington Street from Newton Corner to West Newton. Here's a copy of the survey in paper form. You can find it online at the newtonmass.gov website. Of note, many of our survey questions referenced specific developments already envisioned or planned, allowing people to comment on real situations. Key findings of this survey include most residents want to learn more about what's going on before the changes are already decided. That's why they're here tonight. And they indicated that they want more information on a number of development topics related to rezoning. The majority of respondents want developers to maintain the look and feel of the existing villages, keeping building heights below 4 stories. This is from the survey. Most respondents wanted villages to grow responsibly, with a well-balanced mix of residences, businesses, green spaces, and transportation options. Please go online and read our survey analysis. You can find it by going onto the city website at www.newtonmass.gov, then clicking on City Government, then clicking on Neighborhood Area Councils, and going to Newtonville. Once you're on our Newtonville Area Council webpage, then the analysis report is the first green highlighted report. Click on it and it will open and you'll see the cover like this. Finally, I would like to ask all Newton Area Council members to please stand up. If you have any questions, you'll be able to contact one of us, Mark Hoffman, Tariq Lucas, Susan Reisler, Peter Bruce. Is anyone else here tonight? I saw Helene Strote and Dana D'Agostino. I'm Maura Harrington, and we also, I don't see Tom Krause here, but he's also on the Area Council. So I'd like to thank you very much, and thanks to the Planning Department for allowing us to make this public announcement at their meeting.
Okay, who's next on that side of the room? You can sit in your seat. We'll bring the microphone to you. Don't be bashful about raising your hand either.
Okay, I'm Peter Bruce. I'm on the Newtonville Area Council, but I'm just speaking for myself right now. The Department of Transportation recommends that road diets or lane reductions not be done when the traffic volume exceeds 20,000 trips a day or more. And Washington Street has 23,000 to 25,000. Also Needham Street has, I think, around 18,000. So Needham Street has the same configuration as is being proposed for Washington Street, with a reduction of the number of through lanes from 2 to 1 and a turning lane in the middle. It doesn't have bike lanes right now or big sidewalks, but the traffic configuration is the same. So if you want to see if you think the future would work with this kind of road configuration, check out Needham Street at busy times and imagine what it would be like with about 25% more traffic. Thank you.
This is a comment that pertains particularly to West Newton and people who live south of West Newton Square. In a couple of the plans I've looked at that partially justify the idea of 6-story buildings along Davis Street, which is just up against the north side of the Mass Pike, is that it would block sound in West Newton Square, and that might well be true. But the other side of the coin is it will increase sound for the residential neighborhoods south of the Mass Pike, because those buildings will act as large reflectors. So anybody who lives south of the pike in West Newton Square. In other words, the residential neighborhood, as opposed to the businesses, will have more noise and not less noise. And so that's a concern.
So that's actually a good point. So we've been working on another idea that might still be a little bit too out there, but if you look at the south side of the pike, there's a lot of leftover highway land. And honestly, I think DOT did Newton a huge disservice when they designed the pike. They did everything they possibly could to not make it friendly to Newton. And I think that's because the city held up the pike for, I think, a better part of a decade. So I think you can have an opportunity to repair this now by the development on the north side, but on the south side, you might actually be able to build some retaining walls in certain areas and actually extend out and create parkland. So, yeah, totally. It totally depends on where. Yeah, yeah. And we've looked at doing a much more expensive deck park right there at West Newton. And you know, the cost of those things are substantial. You can look at some of the data on the board. But so I think it's a real scar, you know, regionally, all of these highways. And how do you deal with that and still preserve this village life is super important. I think the other thing what we didn't talk a lot about in the presentation is the idea of the sort of Olmstedian tradition of landscape design and the fact that trees and dense bushes and all of these things are actually good for not only capturing the sound and buffering it, but there's some emerging research coming out of MIT that it's actually very good at catching small particulate coming off the highway. So I think there's a landscape element here that has to really resonate with Newton, but also would help with the mitigation of the highway.
Buildings can be a sound barrier in one direction and a sound amplifier in the other.
Yeah, totally, yeah.
Hello? All right. For the roadway reconfiguration, Washington Street is about 2 miles long from Newton Corner up into Chestnut Street, West Newton-ish, about 2 miles long. Do you have to do the same roadway reconfiguration for all those 2 miles, or can you just break it off by a fourth or a third and do different styles, different reconfigurations for the entire length? That's all.
Yeah, no, super good question. The answer is yes. It can. It's actually the best way to do it is make the road repair contextual. So in different segments of Washington Street, you know, there's different characters, but there's also different requirements, different widths. So we've looked at that, and I think it's essential that something carries through the entirety of it, though, so you actually feel as if it's the opportunity to make it a landscape feature for Newton, not just the village centers. And I think that's this idea that the continuous tree canopy that goes throughout village centers and is consistent throughout, whether you're 3 lanes or at some places you might have to drop a parking lane to get a fourth turn lane back in, or if you drop down to 2 lanes entirely, which might be on the western edge. So there might be a variety of ways that the street can be designed to be contextual to that part of Washington Street, but I think there's this consistency of a continuous forested street and this idea that there's a commuting potential for bicyclists to continue throughout, with some important feedback that we heard from you all up to this point in the process. So I think that's going to be the trick and why we really want you to go out and test these ideas. And you could test it in certain different parts and then calibrate the design appropriately. Good question.
Yep, this guy over here.
Yep. Hi, I'm Dan Shaw from Newton Corner, where everything looks beautiful down at the western end of Washington Street, going to West Newton Square. But you speak about designing bike lanes and traffic control and a tree canopy. What do you do when you get to the Circle of Death, aptly named?
That's a good question. Yeah, it's noticeably absent here. But maybe Barney, do you want to talk about? No, to answer your question though, there are solutions for Newton Corner that we looked at in June. We came up with a bunch of ideas for Newton Corner. If you actually look at the historic maps, it was Nonantum Square at the time, and you kind of had this interesting sort of weave in the street that created a four-way intersection right there. And if you can kind of stitch those streets back together and build some new bridges, and there's a lot of things that are possible in Newton Corner. The big issue is how do you mitigate the Mass Pike? And the big opportunity is how do you put a new subway station there to encourage that as a business center for Newton? And that's a big question. And if you look at some of the long-range planning that the state DOT is doing and BTA has done, there's potential for that place for more frequent rail service along this line. And ideally, Newton should get in a position where that's one of the stops, and that's coupled with new zoning and placemaking ideas about how you can repair Newton Corner so it's one of these places. So, and then I'll hand it to Barney to talk about how that can maybe get done.
Thanks, Russ. Yeah, no, Russ is right. The issue with Newton Corner is it really deserves its own study. That's how complicated it is, and there are a lot of partners involved that Russ mentioned. I think we have kind of laid some of the groundwork through Russ's work as to the types of ideas that it would take to make some radical change in Newton Corner. So there are some piecemeal approaches that could happen as well, but real radical change is going to take real radical approaches and a big investment. So we are very interested. We're planners. We love grappling with these kinds of problems.
I think it's important to note that we're trying to capture as many good ideas about Newton Corner as we can in this process and be able to set up a more deep dive so that they have the benefit of everyone's knowledge from this. So I think, a real easy tweak right now is just looking at the off-ramp going inbound to Boston, I guess that's east, making it 2 lanes. Kind of fixing, there's a little intersection tweak that could happen. So we've heard little sort of low bar interventions, and then kind of blue sky thinking too. So it's a good question. So we had a hand in the back, and then we'll come to you in the front. Sorry, Lily, you're going to be running back and forth.
Hi, I'm Kathleen Carell Grazer. Hi, Dan. I live in Newtonville, and I'm on the board of directors of the Newton Villages Alliance. And I'm happy to see in these depictions mostly buildings that look to be 4 stories or less. Some of us were alarmed by what we saw at the chili cook-off event, where we saw on the proposed decking above the pike, buildings that looked to be 10 stories, and where we saw at different points on a map, a schematic of Washington Street, dark blue zones that appeared to be zoned for high-density apartment buildings. And I just spoke to Robert Korf, and I was asking him about his expectations about this process, because we were told when you were hired that this process was to get ahead of Mr. Korf, and he said he was waiting to see what was going to come out of this, and then he would submit his proposals. So my question is, since we know that you're going to propose zoning that's going to be dropped into the new zoning ordinance, what is the height of the tallest building that we can expect in that zoning along Washington Street?
There's a complicated answer to that, which is there's a lot of different zoning districts that I think are going to result from this. Washington Street's probably going to have 8 different zones. We're still working that out. I think that's part of the feedback we want to get here. So, for example, it could be 10 or 12 stories at West Newton Station if that were going to be a radical redevelopment with a new park on top of the highway and trying to capture commercial growth with new office buildings. So that's one likely solution there. Or it's an incremental approach where there's no radical changes to infrastructure or no change to highway on-ramps or off-ramps there. There isn't an on-ramp on that side. And And that you might see 4, 5, 6 stories. So I think we're really trying to understand how these are all interconnected. But then, so going back to the work in June, we did hear loud and clear there's some spots in, particularly around Walnut Street, there are spots that are very sensitive, and this sort of caring for and enhancing the village center was something that emerged out of those discussions. And if you go back and look at those drawings and the slideshow from that part of the process, we were looking at solving the sort of issues with the highway, the station, and all that with a air rights development right at Walnut Street. And we heard folks loud and clear that that wasn't appropriate in that area. So we've put that on the cutting room floor, so to speak, as an idea. So that's why it's important we hear from you tonight. Where are we getting the height right? And then, but where are we also getting some of the parks, public spaces, the elements of the village life that can improve right? And how can we sort of balance those two things? So it's everything from 3, 4 stories in some places to, is this right for 10, 12 if you get all these other things that come along with sort of a transformational type project or plan for places like that. So.
And if you don't get feedback asking for buildings taller than 4 stories high, are you still going to zone?
This process requires a lot of different iterations. So I can't answer that question right now because we don't know what the zoning is. We think we know where some places are. This is the idea of getting clarity. Some things are getting more clear, other things are not. So we need your input on that.
See if I can do this right. Julia Maliki, I live in West Newton. One quick comment on the West Newton, and there's so much here that needs to be studied, but I noticed on the so-called market-driven option for West Newton, you've eliminated the former West Newton Branch Library, now the police annex. That's city property. To me, market-driven suggests what can happen under current zoning now. That cannot happen unless the city decided to sell that building, and we should not sell it. But I have a more general comment. I see a lot of questions for the public. Would you be willing to accept higher buildings to help pay for XYZ nice thing? So that implies that it will only partially pay for whatever that nice thing is. The rest is going to come from us, the taxpayers. And what is the cost? And is that something we even want? It's kind of like, do I want to sell my kidney to buy a Lamborghini? Well, I don't want to sell my kidney and I don't want the Lamborghini. So it just doesn't seem to be it's kind of enticing people with some nice thing without acknowledging that there's going to be a lot more cost to all of us. And I think I had another point, but that's basically it. And the ultra-high buildings appear to be mostly residential, and I haven't seen anywhere where residential development will even pay for itself, let alone finance other nice things. So it just seems to be a fiscal negative, not a fiscal positive. Thank you.
I can take a crack at that one. So an example of that, Julia, would be the MBTA station. So we know generally what the price tag is for creating just basic accessibility at Auburndale, West Newton, and Newtonville. It's about $55 million. It's going to take some combination of state, local, and most likely private, public-private, to fill that gap. There's no one entity that's likely to step up and cover the complete cost of that. So that's an example of a project. If the community views it as a priority, you've got to figure out a way to cost share that kind of a project.
So would we basically be looking at an override specifically?
I'm not going to speak to that, Julia. We're a long way away from that. But that's a big number to try and fill. So it depends on priority and community will. So.
Okay, question in the back?
I have laryngitis, so I apologize. I'm Jenna Andelman from Newton Center. I'm wondering who's counting up all of these potential additional households that are going to be built, and who's comparing that to how many households, residents, services, places in schools that Newton thinks that we can actually provide, because, you know, the schools are already full. You know, how many more garbage collection, you know, how much more of all these services we need? And is someone keeping count and matching that up with what we would need to do?
Yes. Well, so this is why the fiscal impact analysis of this is always like a half step behind. So each of these possible futures, the market-driven, the courtyard, and the incremental, they have various different results from what they can create. And, you know, so we've looked at some ranges to sort of get a sense of, well, what's going to be possible, and just to establish that it's net fiscal positive. And that's the goal. I think I showed that slide earlier. So what we're showing on the wall now, we're fairly certain with our schematics that we've been doing that are net fiscally positive. And our fiscal impact member of the team has spent a lot of time with the school department, a lot of time with all the city departments for building a model to look at how this affects and impacts the. No, I think the school planning, you know, maybe Barney can talk to, but the city is well aware of that.
So I don't want to speak for the schools, but they are due out with their enrollment projections pretty soon. That'll give you a sense of where they are with the school population. But this doesn't all happen at once. It's a bit overwhelming to look at all of this and say, oh my goodness, what are they going to do? What are we going to do with all these households and potentially the kids? But it doesn't. And you try to figure out how many school children will result, and where there's capacity in the schools, and what district you're in, and how you solve it. So that's really how you look at it. We're looking at a much more global approach to the schools as well, thinking about capital planning and school expansion and all of that. So that's part of, you know, everyday life in terms of figuring out so that we can be ahead of the curve in terms of enrollment and projected population in the schools.
Good evening. My name is Peter Harrington. I have worked and lived within 500 feet of Washington Street for over 50 years. I go up and down Washington Street almost on a daily basis. I've seen at least 2 other plans to improve things in West Newton Square, and they haven't worked. I think that I'm pretty much against your proposals. I think they're very nice. I think there's a lot of work that's gone into them. But I think that what you're doing is making a choice for us who live on or near Washington Street. You're making our choice about what it's going to look like. And a lot of people on the north side of the city feel there's some sort of class discrimination going on, that you're sort of picking on us, and that you're going to rebuild Washington Street and nearby environs and Newtonville, and Newton Corner, and Nonantum, and turn it into a Brookline type of atmosphere, a much more urban apartment type of atmosphere. And they think that if you could turn it into something like Newburyport, where they have a lower scale and lower density and a village feel to their new construction, not old construction, new construction, that we would be better off, at least those of us who live on or near Washington Street. So I think that we have some basic problems. Your website says that most of the people want 2, 3, and 4-story buildings, but when I looked at all the plans, they seem to me to be 5, 6-story buildings. Kathleen says there were 4. I didn't notice many 4. I noticed a lot more, much taller buildings. And I think 10 and 12, and I understand 18 stories at Riverside. I think these buildings don't fit into the village type of concept for Newton. And just one final point I'll make is that in the 1970s, the population of Newton was around 90,000 people. And I understand it's around 90,000 people now. And I understand that the housing units have increased by about 8,000. So there's been a change in the makeup of the city. We've increased the housing units, but we have kept the population about the same. And people are concerned as you add in all these new units, what it's going to do to the increasing the cost of not only of municipal services, but of school services. Thank you.
I'd like to know how you think it should be fixed then. Because you say you've been here a long time. Let me ask you a question. The village life that you guys care for, how do we improve that? And is Washington Street something that is able to change to improve that? Because I want to understand if your critique is of just the buildings or if the idea of improving the village life being possible.
Well, I found out over the years that if you let my neighbor build a 6-story building, then I'm going to want to build a 6-story building on my land.
Okay.
I don't know. Do I need the mic? I guess you do. I've found over the years that with development, once you build one 5-story, 6-story building, people all around are going to want to build the same thing because that is the value. The value of the land goes up depending on what they can build. And as you spread that out, what happens is you change the village concept. Now, I looked at some of the things that you've done, and you've worked with, at least what I've seen on your website, buildings that have sloped roofs and they're not too tall, and they sort of fit into the surrounding area. To put a 6-story building in the middle of single and 2-family homes or at the edge of them is with a flat roof. And then we build flat roofs all up and down Washington Street, and we cram them all in. And this is going to change. It's going to destroy the village concept, because what's going to happen is we're going to have a linear village from, is it 2 miles? Someone said 2 miles from the Circle of Death to West Newton Square, or maybe all the way to the Wellesley line. But I would like to see you look at the concept of having some architectural style to the buildings, not what I guess some people call modern American, where it's a square block building with a flat roof.
Federalist or yeah.
Federalist? They had no roofs, the Federalist houses?
Well, I mean, architectural guidelines, I think, is essential for Newton. I think there is a tradition here of building high-quality buildings, and you should build on that. So,
well, I'm not going to get into that argument with you. The issue is that you're putting up square block or rectangular block buildings that do not conform to the existing village structures. And we would rather have existing village structures rather than a new style of building. We don't want to become Brookline West. We would like to stay.
No, I get that. I mean, that's why I wanted to dig into this a little bit more, because I think my entire talk was about how do we make this incredibly about Newton. So this is a very important discussion, and I think that's why it's not us making decisions. It's us trying to facilitate this dialogue with your community and your community members. So your opinion and everyone else's opinion, we're trying to pull together and bring clarity to. So
that project you did in Maine had a nice style of building.
Right, because it's in a small town in Maine.
Yeah, well, many people think that concept would fit well in Newton because villages are not large urban areas. They're villages, they're smaller centers. Rather than...
I get it. Yeah.
So I have a suggestion. Why don't you guys talk afterwards so I can get to the Red Sox game? No. So let's do...
Do you want an answer for the Red Sox game? We're going to win.
Good. Let's do a couple quick questions, maybe 3 or 4. Does that sound about right?
Hi, my name is Judy Sludnick. I live in West Newton, and I just have a suggestion. I personally am probably in a small minority, and I'm excited about this. I think that it's going to happen, and I don't have a problem with it being just a little bit more like Brookline. I think that what the population here would really benefit by is not having drawings that are coming in from a bird's eye view. Because at that point, you see the volume of the density. And I think since the types of photographs that we were picking out in June were on a scale that was more human, that was more of a normal vision. And I would suggest that the next round of drawings have some that are more on a street level, so that you're not seeing everything that's behind the other buildings.
Yeah, no, you're exactly right. This process is responsive, where the bird's eye shows you all the intricacies of the urban environment. You know, and I'm using that word because your villages are places where people walk, and I think that's an intentional definition where you prioritize the public life of the village. I go to the drugstore, I go get a coffee, I go get my haircut, and then I walk home. That's how these all used to function. So they're urban. That's the sense of, there was villages where markets, where commerce happened, all of that. You still have that framework. And for us, understanding how all of that connected was the best way to illustrate that as comprehensively as possible as these bird's eyes. But we understand that this is really how people experience space.
Right.
And I think what the feedback we get and the input we get from this is very, and next steps in the process will result in some updated renderings that will show that.
Because a lot of those local businesses that everyone wants to keep are kind of in your drawings hidden by the trees. They're there.
Okay, good point.
They're there.
So if anyone, let's talk afterwards about specific spots that these would be helpful too, because that would be enlightening for us.
Hi, my name's Ann Dorfman, and I'm just responding to some of the comments people have said and things I've read on the board, which suggests that people think that somehow or other, what Peter Harrington was saying, he didn't like these buildings, he wanted everything to stay small, but my understanding, I want you to correct me if I'm wrong, is that we're talking about how our commercial and multi-unit residential buildings going to develop over time, given that we have spaces which we have allocated as being okay for those developments. And what we're trying to do is, in fact, come up with a zoning that will not allow them to do what they can right now do by right, which is pretty much anything they want within some minimal restrictions. And what you've been hired to do is help us better refine what those limitations and restrictions should be and how to create a model that better reflects the desires of the community instead of the needs of the developer.
Yeah, that's I might be too tired to articulate it as clearly.
Yeah, so one piece of that I just want to make clear is what we have now is somewhat unpredictable. We're hoping to make a very predictable approach to this. So it's not necessarily what could happen now, although it could happen, as opposed to this is what we want to happen.
This is a problem with zoning throughout the U.S. Zoning, oftentimes results in things people are totally surprised by. And that's because zoning is a tool that communities actually, I've said this before, it's one of the few tools we as humans have to control the future. It's an instruction manual for how, maybe it's next year, maybe it's 25 years from now, someone's going to make decisions about what to do with a piece of property. And there's zoning on all of these properties now that give people land rights to do stuff. And then you have other zoning things in Newton that make it, you can do other things that no one knows about. And I think that's the confusion, is there's no predictable understanding of what the future might be for Washington Street. And that's exactly what we're trying to do, is create a vision and then put in regulations that will inform future decisions to get to that vision.
And you can't, I mean, my understanding is the goal for a city and, you know, a community like Newton is not to freeze us in time, but to think forward about what our future should be, not let growth happen everywhere around us, but not here. And we have to be part of the future. And the question really is, are we comfortable with the guidelines we currently have? And I would say right now, my feeling is, and I think what I hear from other people, is developers come in and they do whatever they want, and we don't get to make a choice about it. And what we want to do is set up more specific guidelines, but we can't say you can't do anything. We have to come up with guidelines that allow for growth and development.
So I just have one comment and one quick question. I'm somewhat confused on what we need to do large developments to fund other than the train station. So maybe you can answer that question. Aside from that, I would hate to see what we all agree is the scar of the turnpike turn into the scar of the high rises along the turnpike. So that's sort of just my one question around what else do we need to fund that we would need this public-private partnership.
Well, I think that's part of this process is to determine. I mean, just the street improvements, you know, that's a piece of this puzzle. The train stations, you know, we have a big list of all the kind of ideas that have come out of this process so far. I think it's, you know, looking at the trade-offs that as a site-by-site basis could have, like this site at Craft Street here, and this is not suggesting that Whole Foods goes away. Whole Foods could be in new buildings, you know, all the businesses could stay. But the question is, well, do you want a neighborhood park there too? Do you want a large neighborhood park? You know, there's some interesting urban designs things that happen there with creating, you know, sort of this transition moment between the residential neighborhood, a park, and then to the mixed-use portion of Washington Street. That might need to be funded through the developer, you know, or the developers. You know, there's many sites here that could come together. So that's a question. If that's a priority, then it might be that in the zoning, we encourage development of this scale or this size, that they have to provide a civic space. You know, and that's part of the process of building in that district. So we're trying to get that kind of information from you as well.
So my name is Brian Barish, and I live in Newtonville. I've been talking to a lot of folks around town lately, and one of the things I found as I talk about planning is that there is an openness to different options for what the community might develop around in terms of, you know, height and scale. But what I really find is that people don't have a good understanding for what the trade-offs are and what benefits they might get if they allow a little more density or a little more height. And so the more you can, when you get to your final plan, explain, if you go to this scale, what is the community getting in return? I think that would really improve community buy-in to the process.
Yeah, the community benefits that private development can generate are directly related to scale. So let's be clear about that. I think that's good feedback. Some others have given me that feedback already. And we have a pretty good understanding of the real estate dynamics in Boston, so we'll try and put that together, because I think that's an important piece of this, because, you know, it's you're not going to get it all. There's going to be some way to figure out how to get some of it and some of this and some of this. So that's this idea of bringing clarity, is the trade-offs. But the community benefits and how private development, the private industry can help is an essential part of that equation.
3 questions.
I told Barney we'd go till midnight if we needed to.
Hi, my name is Pam Schufro, and I live in Newtonville. And is this on? It's more of a clarification, I guess. So are you suggesting that most people in your survey and also the NAC survey suggest that they like 3 to 4 story buildings? You're suggesting that we can't get community benefits if we have 3 to 4 story buildings because it won't pay for trees, little open space, a little pocket park or
No,
something
I mean,
like that.
that's what the rules of thumb like that are so difficult to pin down. It depends on the size of the building, the location, what was there before, how much. It's a complex thing to look at, and that's why we've actually spent time looking at it site by site by site, so that we can start to determine what the community's vision is for those particular sites, and then we can actually run some math on those specific buildings and look at how they might, be developed and what they might generate for the city and all that. So that's why this idea of form and where different forms are appropriate is so key, because it will inform the math, the numbers. Yeah, but zoning, so this is something that we'll probably do a very deep dive on a little later in the process. The zoning is not one zone. The zoning in, I don't know where the board is, but they'll have, Washington Street has a number of different characters, call it that. So as the character changes, we want the zoning district to change to reflect that character. And it might be an existing character, like the residential sections of Washington Street, or it might be, we actually want a new character, something that's more compatible to the village life that we've heard from you all. So the zoning will be as responsive as it needs to this vision. So. What? There'll be we'll all have this in a report, yes. Yeah, a vision plan, yeah. Some is going online. Is it online? Tomorrow.
Yeah, I'm curious to know how we figure out how many additional housing units Newton can handle, because it's not only Washington Street. We're hearing about Northland, we're hearing about Riverside. I mean, I get the feeling that there are pressures outside of Newton. It's a booming economy and we need more housing. But I mean, the talk of 3 stories, 4 stories, all has to do with how many housing units, right, we're talking about. So what's the basis? How do we figure out what Newton can handle?
I mean, this is slightly, do you want to take a crack at the city scale questions? I know you want to, does anyone know the score? 1-0. Okay.
That's a great question. We struggle with that every day. That's very high on the mayor's priority too, is determining how big does Newton get. It's really a project by project. It's looking at capacity. It's looking at things like traffic and transportation and schools and municipal services. And I think the bottom line, to a great extent, is the fiscal benefits that come with it. So that, does it make sense? Does it pay for itself, in other words, or even pay for more than itself and something else to go with it? But what does it do? Does it detract from the quality of life that exists? Those are really hard questions, and they're really project specific.
Okay, last question to you.
My question is a little similar. I've already talked about this with your staff. It would be really helpful if we could talk about Washington Street in the context of what is being proposed for Riverside and the stress that would place on traffic, infrastructure, schools, also the Northland development on the south side, because this is wonderful to consider a 2-mile corridor, but I don't know how many people here have gone to meetings about Riverside yet, because they may not be in the affected villages. It would be very useful if you could, as you're considering what we might want Washington Street to look like, is to take into consideration proposed 18-story towers at Riverside, or the very large development that Northland has, and what that's going to do to our quality of life. Thanks.
That's happening. Well, I mean, it's coming through the city hall. I mean, those projects are, so I mean, we're not looking at Riverside or Northland as part of this work, but the city part of the team is certainly.
Oh yeah, we're looking.
I mean,
we're looking at Northland very closely, since that's been filed and we're examining every aspect of that, just like I was talking about before, to see what the total impact is going to be on the community. So you're talking about the cumulative effect of projects, which I get. Which again, I would refer back to this, which is this doesn't happen all at once. Projects tend to happen one at a time, and at some point maybe there is a capacity issue, and you decide, you know, that's it, we can't take it. I don't know when that is or how you make that decision, but you look at them each individually and see what their additive value is for the city and whether they add or detract and how they do that and what the trade-offs are. So it's complicated stuff. And each of the projects is decided individually. So yeah, so you know what, I'm going to talk to you offline on that so I can let folks go home. I'd like to really thank everyone for coming this evening.
Yeah, thank you for hanging out late. We appreciate the discussion.
I have one more thing to say. If you haven't left your email with us, but would like an email with the link to all the information, please make sure to leave your email with us, and we'll put some extra paper. It looks like we packed up, but we'll put some extra paper out here. Thank you.
Oh, no, I know. Oh, we can invite people to watch. Oh, God. Let's go from your personal one. So...